to learn about relational evangelism, right? Relational evangelism. And by the way of introduction, I wanted to say evangelism evangelism is, there are three types of evangelism. Three types of evangelism. Number one is a proclamational evangelism. Yes, proclamational evangelism. That is number one. And number two is confrontational evangelism. Third, relational evangelism. So there are three types of evangelism. What is proclamational evangelism? Right? Proclamational evangelism is kind of preaching, preaching. That is what you proclaim the gospel. On a Sunday, a pastor will proclaim the gospel. A preacher will proclaim the gospel. That's a proclamational. Second is confrontational evangelism. What is that? It is like sometimes confronting people, like door to door. You go to house and talk to them. Or street preaching is kind of confrontational evangelism. And tractor distribution, also kind of confrontational evangelism. So yes, there is confrontational evangelism is there, right? Proclamation is mainly preaching. Confrontational is much like there. In the confrontation, people can ask questions, right? Third is relational evangelism. What is a relational evangelism? It is reaching people through relationship, right? Relationship. Reaching people through relationship. So that is what relational evangelism. And this is in the context of everyday life, right? Everyday life. Now, how as a church we need to see this one? Yes, number one, as a church, for the growth of the church, every believer must develop a redemptive relationships with those who do not know Christ, right? This is required, that God wants all of us, why? To develop redemptive relationship. So get that word. Let me write it again to emphasize, right? Redemptive relationship. Redemptive relationship. We are expected to focus, maintain relationships that are redemptive in nature. The purpose is redemption. The purpose is gospel. We must tell these people the gospel that give them a verbal witness about who is Jesus. Who is Jesus? We must actively seek to introduce them to the fellowship of God's people. Actively seek them to introduce. So relational evangelism is to begin the relationship, share the gospel, invite them to the church, right? So begin the relationship, that's number one. Then verbal witness, share the gospel. Then third is invite them to the church, right? That is the three things that we need to look at. Now, let's look at a verse as far as our mission is concerned. This is a passage that we have looked at already, but we wanted to look at for this part of the series, right? Gospel of John chapter 17. Can one of you please read Gospel of John chapter 17, verse 14.
Yeah. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Continue to 18, sir.
Yes.
I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I also have sent them into the world.
Send them into the world, right? World. Many times Jesus repeated the word, right? So what we need to understand, first of all, the fact of the matter is that Christianity is to be distinctive. Yes. So how do we identify, right? There are many ways. Number one, difference without identification, known as isolation, right? Isolation. And the other one is assimilation, that identification without a difference. And the third is communication. There are three ways you can be in the world, right? Number one, you can isolate yourself from the world, right? Like remember the other day I talked about Amish groups, right? They are very, very prevalent in the United States and other part of the Americas, like maybe Southern America as well. There a lot of people are there. What they do, they live as a community. They go and live in a remote place. Others are not in their community. They always wanted to be separate. They live as communities. That is what isolation. Maybe there are people, sometime even, I don't know whether we have anyone, like maybe some of the I would say, East, like northeastern states have that kind of habit, right? What they do, they isolate themselves and nobody else will live among them, right? Nobody else will have the opportunity to live with them, right? That is what isolation. A lot of people do that, right? That's one thing you can do, but it is not what really God wants us to do. Second is what? Assimilate. Like you be like the world. Do what they do? Nothing, right? So that is identification without a difference. There is no difference at all. No difference at all from the world. You just leave like everybody leaves. Nothing. The third way is that identification with the difference. What is that? Yes, you are in the world, but you are not going to be living like all other people. You are going to have a difference as you live in the world, where you communicate to the people who you are, right? Communication. This is who you are. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to talk to someone in assembly, and I were asking the question, who am I? And trying to explain who am I, right? So you try to communicate to the people, right? So that is what it is expected from here, right? So this is what God wants us to. God doesn't want us to be isolate or assimilate, but God wants us to communicate, right? So when Jesus says, not of the world, yes, these people are, because I'm not of the world. What Jesus does, he makes plain and clear distinction between disciples and those who do not know the Father, right? Jesus says, I am not of this world. I'm not of this world. These disciples are all not of this world. Yeah, it cannot be easily assimilated like that, right? So one thing that, yes, we talk about separation, but we don't want it to isolate, right? So there is a difference between assimilation or isolation. Isolation is completely apart from the world, like you go and live as a community. Second is the assimilation. I said it is the opposite to isolation, right? Without any difference, you live without any difference, right? So this end, the essentially conveys the impression that being committed believer is no different than being a non-believer. Believer and non-believer, there is no difference at all. That is not also right. This is absolutely wrong. What we need, we are identified here. We are in the world, but with a difference, right? Communication. This is the balance point. We recognize that there is essential and fundamental differences between the values and practices of the believer and the non-believer. We believe, right, values of believers and unbelievers. And that means we need to live out as we communicate the gospel. We need to show them the differences of our values and practices. That is what we need to look at here, right? So this is very, very important in our discussion. Now, so we are to be communicative. We are not to be isolated, not to be assimilated, but communicative. Second, Christianity is to be displayed. Displayed. We have Jesus Christ as the example. Look at what Jesus did. I have 4 verses, right? Let's look at number 1, John 1:14. Can we read John 1:14? Anyone? Now, if you please. John 1:14.
And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth.
All right. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The Word became flesh. So Jesus lived among unbelievers. Right? Number 2, let's look at Matthew 11:19. Matthew 11:19. Matthew 11:19.
The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a wine bibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by her children.
So this is what you read. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say he's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So what is that? Jesus was a friend of unbelievers. He befriended unbelievers. Befriended unbelievers. Right? He established a relationship with unbelievers. Sometimes some people say, using verse 1 of Psalm, that you should not have a relationship with unbelievers, which is just opposite. That's not what one actually really talk about. That basically says that you should not be actively participating in their sinful activities. That is true. But you need to establish friendship with unbelievers. Third, he cared for unbelievers. Cared for unbelievers. Let's look at Matthew 9. Matthew 9, verse 36.
But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them because they were weary and scattered, like sheep having no shepherd.
Yeah, they were harassed and helpless. And Ivy says, he had compassion on unbelievers, right? He saw them like a sheep without a shepherd. Yes. So he cared for unbelievers. Fourth, he helped unbelievers. Helped unbelievers. Let's look at 11:5.
The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor.
Yes. So Jesus' pattern, right, the way that he wants to display Christianity is in these 4 ways. He lived among them, befriended them, cared for them, helped them. That's how Jesus displayed Christianity. So the question that we needed to ask here is that how do we display Christianity? Do we follow Christ's pattern, or we try to isolate ourselves? Right? That is the question that has to be asked. Second point that we need to understand is the misunderstanding. Right? Misunderstanding. As far as world is concerned, how do we understand this verse? 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 19, 9 to 13. Right? 1 Corinthians chapter 5. verses 9 to 13.
I wrote to you in my letters not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all, meaning the people of this world who are immoral or greedy and swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave the world. But now I am writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard, a swindler. Do not eat with such people.
Yes, so it is very clear that I have written to you that you do not associate with sexual immoral people. I'm not talking about the immoral people of this world. I'm talking about the so-called brother who is immoral, right? So that is what he says. Now there is one more thing we need to look at here. That is 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. 2 Corinthians 6:14, we read, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? What fellowship can light have with the darkness? So this is the tension, right? It's a big tension. We are told we should not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, yes. James says, friendship with the world is enmity with God. You are not to be, friendship with the world, right? We should not love the world or not things. 1 John chapter 2, we read. We are not at home in this world. Philippians, we read that we are heavenly citizens. Our citizenship is in heaven. So how do we like correlate where once you need to befriend unbelievers, the other says friendship with the world is enmity with them. How do we? Right? Now, some have taken this to the point of suggesting that the believer and unbeliever should not have friendship together at all. It is preached and taught that any company with the lost is somehow a compromise and will lead to certain contamination and spiritual defeat. We should not be overly surprised by this teaching. It had already surfaced Paul's day, right? Let's look at what is his response. He finds two glaring faults with the line of reasoning, right? There are two, right? First of all, we tend toward confusing our purpose, right? Our purpose. Now, when we looked at verse 9 of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, this is what we read. We are not called to retreat from society, right? That's not our purpose. Our purpose is what? We are called to penetrate society. Not to isolate yourself, but penetrate. That's what you are told. Because your purpose is what? Gospel. Reaching people with the gospel. None can reach the gospel reach people with the gospel without penetrating society. Right? So that is one thing. Second is what? We tend towards assuming a privilege that is not ours. Right? What is the privilege that we are talking about? Yes. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5 that we looked at, this is what you read in verse 12. What business of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge inside? God will judge those who are outside, right? We tend to pass judgment on sinners. That is we tend to see them as sinners and offer, we don't offer salvation at all. Like we don't offer the gospel, right? So that is the problem. We are not commanded to begin a monastery. We are not commanded to go to the jungle, go to the top of a hill and live. You need to live among the people, right? So we don't have a privilege of judging unbelievers. That God will do at the end. for their sin. You don't have to. You don't have to judge people for their sin, right? So that is very important here. This is the misunderstanding that many people have. Yes, we are not to be friend of this world. We are not to assimilate to the world. We are not to love the world in that way. We need to communicate with a difference, right? That is what we need to do. All right, I think we'll stop it here. Any questions on this?